Welcome to the inaugural episode of Beating Sisyphus, a program organized jointly by the Canizares Center for Emerging Markets with the Cornell Emerging Markets Institute Club. My name is Thomas Riveros, and I'm a member of the Emerging Markets Institute Club. Beating Sisyphus brings together leaders from across economics, technology, finance, policy, and entrepreneurship to explore how innovation emerges under pressure. Through deep, intellectually honest conversations, we uncover strategies, mindsets, and systems that allow emerging markets to overcome barriers and build lasting growth.
The Canizares Center of Emerging Markets just held his annual conference, the celebration of 15 years anniversary, and also the naming of the center. Under the theme, The New Rules and New Opportunities, business leaders, academics, and policymakers discussed the new opportunities that the new rules are creating. After the conference, we started thinking we should continue the discussions. And we, in conversations with EMIC, decided to launch the podcast because we have so much knowledge in this center and to share the knowledge. Why the name Sisyphus? So Sisyphus is a Greek myth, and Sisyphus was a person condemned by the gods to push a heavy stone up the mountain, and then the mountain would fall again, and he would have to do it again forever because he was defying the gods, and the gods punished him with this. Sometimes emerging markets look like Sisyphus. You go up the mountain, yes, this time this particular country is up there, and that will be it, and then a major, massive crisis, devaluation of the currency comes, and you have to start all over again. So we want to think that after the first 25 years of this century and this millennium, emerging markets are in a better position to beat Sisyphus and to continue growth. And that's what we are going to discuss.
And today's theme is What's Next for Africa? We're delighted to bring on the program Brian Frantz, a leading expert in African development with over 20 years of experience working at USAID. We also have with us today Abubakar Idris, a Cornell MBA candidate and former journalist originally from Nigeria. Thank you both so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Thanks for having us. And I think it's great that the inaugural session of this is focused on Africa, which is a region that's often overlooked. And so that's just fantastic that you guys are taking on Africa in the first episode.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. And so I'd like to open up with a question for both of you. Maybe we'll start off with Brian. How have you seen over the past 20 years the economic landscape change in Africa, both from, an economic development perspective in terms of the successes, but also maybe in terms of the challenges as well?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I think maybe let me start with some of the positive. From about 2000 till just before the COVID pandemic hit, maybe 2015 to 2020, I think we saw tremendous poverty reduction in Africa from around a little over 55% down to 35% in that just under 20-year period. And so that was on the back of some pretty robust economic growth generally. So that's one thing. I'll get to the challenges in a minute, but the COVID pandemic kind of reversed some of that trend, unfortunately. A second sort of major dynamic that Abubakar can probably speak to as well is just the growing trend of urbanization. So we're at a point now where just under half of Africa's population is urbanized. And of course, cities are more dynamic, centers of innovation, all that kind of stuff. So that is potentially a really encouraging aspect for future African development, innovation, and so forth. And the last thing that I would just highlight at the top is what you now see is Africa is a continent of, when I think about Africa, I think sub-Saharan Africa. So roughly 49 countries or so, just under 50 countries. So a lot of small countries, small markets, very fragmented. But what happened in, I think, 2018, thereabouts, the countries of the continent agreed to come together and form the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which once sort of fully implemented will be the largest free trade area in the world in terms of numbers of countries and so forth. So potentially huge market, 1.3 billion people, $3.4 trillion in GDP, et cetera. So those are some of the encouraging trends, I think. But again, you also asked about challenges. I think the COVID pandemic it certainly interrupted some of that positive trend on growth and poverty reduction. The international economic environment certainly creates lots of headwinds for Africa, the geopolitical aspect of what's going on, tariff measures and so forth. African countries are also facing large debt burdens again, and that's challenging fiscal space and the ability of these countries to invest in the kind of public goods and infrastructure and so forth that they need to continue their growth trajectory. What is different this time is that the composition of African debt is much more private sector and China than was the case in kind of the previous round in the 1990s. And so that's a different dynamic that needs to be addressed, and that's proving challenging. And I think the last thing that I'll mention is just the negative impacts of climate change, and African countries are having to deal with those challenges probably more than any other region. So we're seeing increasing, more frequent and increasingly intense weather shocks and so forth. And again, you combine that with the debt burden and the lack of fiscal space. And so the ability to respond and invest in resilience to those climate dynamics is increasingly challenged. But let me stop there. So I'm interested in what Abubakar has.
I mean, let's see. I would say over the last 20 years, I think a couple of things that have been encouraging. The very first one is the fact that the continent is still very young. A good chunk of the population is still under the age of 30 to start with. And so that creates opportunities across, a range of industries. And so for me, that's quite encouraging. And so in the sense that it shows the potential for growth in order compared to other regions where they're, facing issues with aging population and the challenges that faces. Africa has a much younger population, which means access to labor force, and that powers the economy in the long term. And so we're hoping that trend will continue and can be beneficial for the continent. The other trend that I've seen that has been quite interesting is the growth of industries. So particularly the technology industry, which I've covered, is one very fascinating trend. Starting in 2010 in particular, we've seen the growth of newer startups that are trying to solve different problems with software and technology broadly. We've seen companies come out and create $1 billion in value for shareholders and also for the continents too. And so that has been very encouraging because it creates an opportunity where newer companies can fuel growth for new industries and for existing industries and transform lives for people across the continent. And so we've seen that trend overall be very helpful. The other things that we've seen to be quite interesting too is the way capital formation is happening. We're seeing more and more capital over the last 20 years going to the African continent to invest in ideas, to fund traditional businesses, to also fund technology businesses. We'll also see the emergence of local fund managers too. And what that means and why that's beneficial is with access to capital, Africa can fund the infrastructure development that it needs to fuel growth. And so we've seen that happen. We've seen that positive trend. We're also seeing also the trend of in terms of more, I would say in some countries there's been a push to be more stable. So that, and be conscious of the fact that stability is crucial to their sustainability. And so we're seeing quite a few countries prioritize that, even though there's been challenges overall. We can talk about that at some point. But obviously, we've seen that trend in countries like in some countries in Francophone Africa that have been conscious about the fact that they have to be politically stable. And they've put in effort to ensure that despite crises that they face, they want to be stable. Like Nigeria has done that. Kenya has done that. Even Senegal has done that. So that is encouraging that they recognize the need for democracy and for stability in that sense. However, the challenges that we still face on the continent are quite diverse. At the same time, the very first one builds off the last point is the fact that still many countries are unstable, and they're still nowhere close to achieving that level of political willpower that will sustain the growth that they need. And at the same time too, we've seen another trend that we've seen that is not positive, is a challenge for the continent, is the existence and spread of insecurity. And so that is, wreaking havoc on the stability of the region. And so that is a big problem. At the same time, too, despite the fact that we have this young population on the continent, many of them still can't find jobs. And then the educational system or infrastructure is still lagging in terms of like providing them with the necessary skills that they need to be able to play a bigger role in the broader economy. However, we've seen the trends, we've seen the good things and the bad things, but we just have to be optimistic, largely because we've seen the governments try to be more strategic. Like Brian had mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic, caused a reversal in certain areas. But we're seeing more governments like want to put their foot down and handle some of this crisis head on. And so we're hoping that at some point, in the next couple of years, there will be more strategic in terms of how they're deploying solutions to make sure that these countries are more stable and prosperous going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both for, very fascinating kind of deep dive there. I want to get in a little bit kind of related to what both of you were saying, especially you with Abubakar on the importance of stability. And I want to go with Brian to your field. What have you learned about how aid actually works on the ground, especially in the context of those more unstable, regimes and areas? And in what ways do you see the importance of stability changing? And also, how do you actually operate in a position like that?
Yeah, great question. So, I think in my experience, the most effective aid programs and operations are those that reinforce local commitment to development progress generally. And I, throughout my 25-year career at USAID, I basically saw my job as supporting local leaders, whether they be in government at various levels, national, local, whatever, civil society, business, supporting those kinds of folks who are trying to improve their countries, seeking them out, providing them financial support, technical support, political, diplomatic support, etc. These folks that are trying to improve their countries and societies. That's tough in some parts of Africa, as you noted, where there are lots of different interests competing for resources, for power, etc. But fundamentally, I saw my job as aligning with those leaders and communities and so forth that were trying to make their societies better. It does take some level of risk tolerance, I think, to work in those kinds of spaces. These are tough places to work. You often don't know what will, at the end of the day, work out when you invest. I think that's important to have that kind of measure of risk tolerance. And I will add that an important thing that we tried to do as USAID is buy down some of that risk for private investors, let's say, for example, who were worried about entering a new market and things like that. And between, for example, credit guarantee programs that we might have, or analyses, feasibility studies that we could finance, et cetera, we were able to kind of bring down some of that risk in some cases for private investors in Africa. But I think equally important as being willing to take some risk is also being willing to walk away when it's clear that things aren't working out, when that local commitment to the vision, the positive vision, has disappeared. And I think that's something we probably didn't do often enough is step back when it was becoming clear that sort of commitment was waning or had disappeared. And then I think the last thing that I'll just say is, again, especially in these very dynamic, politically unstable types of contexts, it's really important to just continually assess and triangulate information and really continuous learning, right? And what does that mean? It means, you've worked out a program with local partners on where you want to go, and you figured out what you think it'll take to get there. But if it's not working, you need to course correct, you need to adapt, you need to adjust, and so forth. And so that, I think just having that mindset of continuous learning, continuous improvement, these are hard places to work. Let's work together with local partners to try to get it right and adjust as we go along. That's kind of the way that I've seen development programs at their best. It's not a marathon, or it is a marathon. I'm sorry, it's not a sprint. And so a little bit of patience, but again, continuous learning, improvement, adaptation, good lessons for individuals, for communities, for countries.
Yeah. And what would you say were some, specific cases when you've seen that continuous learning, adaptation, really, come into play, or maybe other cases where you've been working on in a specific country and it hasn't maybe panned out?
Yeah. So I guess I'll refer to my last field experience, which was working in Somalia, which I don't know if you can get more politically unstable, dynamic, et cetera, as that. But what we were trying to do there was, again, when there was local commitment to overcoming some of the challenges that have allowed violent extremism to emerge and grow and so forth, supporting local leaders in establishing sort of a relationship of trust with their communities. And, we helped these communities, these local leaders, with investments in things like schooling and public health, construction of market infrastructure to allow people some space for basic exchange. Once the security environment proved to be sort of stable enough for that kind of initial development. And so it all came down to the commitment of the national government, the local government, to provide, with support in this case of the U.S. military as well and other international partners, to provide that kind of basic security. When that wasn't there, when in Somalia they have clans, not tribes. So when the clan conflict just became too much, clearly we had to step away. So I think that's I always talk about Somalia as a very hyper-localized context. You could have conflict issues in one village that were vastly different from the conflict dynamics in a village 28 kilometers away. So it's being able to have that local understanding of what is driving conflict, political dynamics, political economy kinds of issues, interests, rent seeking, etc., and being able to cut through all of that, find the leaders who have a reform-minded vision, support them, and try to help them in making their community a better place.
It's fascinating, yeah. And then I guess one last question on the USAID and development front from your experience. How do you see kind of the balance between state-led development models and then private sector-driven growth models in the African context? Has that maybe changed in terms of the policymakers' feelings towards those different ideas, and then also in practice, how do you see those two models play out?
Yeah, I'd be fascinated to hear Abubakar's take on that one as well. I mean, I think the one thing that it has been positive over the course of my 20 plus years working on Africa is that I've sensed that private sector led growth is sort of widely accepted as the way to create sustainable jobs and growth and so forth, in concept, right? And so I think that's a bit of a change in the past 20 years or so. Governments are increasingly have, I think, realized that they need partnerships with the private sector to invest in the sorts of things that will drive future growth and so forth. So again, I think they see that need generally to partner with the private sector. In practice, doesn't always translate, right? And I think there is still a bit of a legacy of some of the socialist experiments on the continent, where remains in some countries a tendency to want to dictate to the private sector, invest here, that kind of thing. So still some discomfort with the more freer approach to the capitalist model, I would say. And then in terms of translating that broader understanding of the need to partner with the private sector and create an environment that's conducive to investment, you still don't have in many places the regulatory capacity and the consistency in the rule of law and the predictability of the investment environment, I think, that would be even more welcoming to the private sector. But as the former business journalist, what do you think?
I think it's been fascinating what's happened. So I'm going to start up with a timeline, say 2000, when, for example, starting off, like Nigeria had just transitioned from like a military regime to democracy. And one of the key things that the government was trying to do was to liberalize, several industries. And one of the key industries that it, focused on was on the telecom industry. At the time, it was a state-led model for the telecom industry, and the government owned entity called Nitel was like had a monopoly in a sense over that industry. But what happened after 2002, I think, with the now former head of the World Bank, or rather MD at the World Bank, Okonjo-Iweala, who was Minister of Finance at the time in 2002, they liberalized this industry and they opened it up to private investments. So we saw the likes of MTN from South Africa come in. We saw the likes of Econet, owned by Sudanese billionaire Mo Ibrahim, and we saw other kinds of companies come into the space. And very quickly, the Nigerian telecom industry began to change. At the time in 2002, there were barely 2.2 million people with access to mobile broadband at the time. Now there are about 145 million people, or more than if my stats are correct. And that change has happened, obviously explosion of population growth on the one hand, but still it's like mobile telecom companies backed by capital from private investors move very quickly to compete on the one hand and also to push access to broadband. And they've done so by improving access to 2G at the time, then 3G after 2007, and then with a broader government support for broadband access starting in 2015, they gradually began to make more investments in 4G. And today they're talking about 5G. They're still very slow on that, but still you can see the depth of, change that has happened over this 20-25 year period, largely driven by the fact that there was private sector involvement in trying to deepen access to broadband. And so we've seen that. And we're also seeing that too in the subsector of technology. We've seen that in the level of funding that has come from private investors to support the growth of newer startups by entrepreneurs. Many of them from the African continent themselves and from local innovators like in Nigeria. And we've seen the kind of innovation that they've come out to produce, including 5 unicorns in different parts of the continent. So I find that private investment or private-led model is useful overall in terms of like spurring innovation, encouraging ideas to form, and encouraging people to take risk in general in order to build new things as opposed to waiting for the government to dictate what's going to happen. We've seen that contrast in Ethiopia, for example, in the sense that it's been government-led for a long time. And so many of their industries are still struggling to grow. And the rest of the continent is like waiting for liberalization regime that the government has promised over the last 5-6 years to take effect. And they're essentially waiting for, faster competition or more tighter competition to happen because of this liberalization regime, in the case of like telecom, for example, and then in banking. And so once you contrast the growth that has happened in Nigeria and in Ethiopia over the same time frame, the level of access that has happened for the different industries like banking and telecoms, you see how much private capital can be beneficial to transforming society in general, as opposed to waiting for the state or for the national government to tell them what to do or to dictate the pace of growth. And so I believe that private, led model can be helpful, but obviously you still need the state to provide certain infrastructure. For example, in security, you also need the states to actually provide support for, logistics and security and logistics, and obviously in agriculture too for food security. And so we've seen that there has to be some sort of middle ground at this point where private investors are still not comfortable taking all the risk to fuel the growth that the country needs. They still need the government to step up and provide some level of guarantee, either funding-wise, either security-wise, either with legislature, with actual justice system enforcement. All those things are critical for the growth of, that private-led model that we've talked about. But for now, we're still, governments have seen that it's beneficial. We're hoping that they'll take that into account in the new policies that they put in place. We're hoping that they will be able to pursue that fully and make transformation and changes for the lives of people on the continent.
If I could add just one thing that I think is important to just acknowledge is as part of the broader global context over this period too, is from 2000 till about 2015 or so, I think you had the Chinese model, so-called model of development, or at least the popularized version of it, seemed very appealing to a lot of African leaders, right? That's largely a state-directed development model, hugely successful in reducing poverty in China and so forth. And China was also investing a lot in Africa. There was a lot of finance available that they were making available. Now that sort of pool of resources has been cut back quite a bit more recently. You've seen some of the, I think, challenges to the state-led model in China emerging, less dynamism, physical infrastructure, housing bubble, construction bubbles, things like that. And so, that model and the resources that came with it, in many cases through the 2000s, are not quite as appealing anymore, I think. And so, again, the realization, almost out of necessity, I think, that for African countries to achieve their very ambitious growth objectives, they're going to have to partner with the private sector. They're going to have to create an environment that is attractive to private investment.
And we think about creating an environment attractive to private investment. One of the things that I think both of you hit on was the importance of local ownership. Now, how do you contrast, trying to promote FDI, versus inward directed investment, basically, investment that's occurring within the country where you have local ownership versus, you have foreign ownership of those assets and investments. Is there a distinction? Should there be a distinction, or should they look to promote both as much as possible?
That's a fascinating question. It's very challenging to answer too, largely because when you think about local ownership, you want to be conscious of where the capital is coming from for, ownership of businesses or, innovation of fused businesses and the expenditure that these businesses have to, carry out. And that, in a sense, has been the story for the African continent in the last decade or so, in the sense that you recognize that the kind of capital, patient capital in particular, that would be needed to kick an idea off the ground and fuel the idea over a longer period until you begin to see tangible returns is missing. And so innovators have had to look elsewhere for that access to capital, particularly abroad in Silicon Valley, in New York, and other financial centers, to raise the funding that they need to start their businesses and grow them successfully on the continent. And so in order to do so, they've had to make a few compromises. For example, they've had to incorporate in the state of Delaware in the US, meaning that many of the companies that you see on the African continent and on the technology side are, in theory, or more likely in practice, not African companies, but Africa-focused companies. As a result, you have this corporate origin story that is very complicated in some cases, but it's not because they just woke up one day and decided to go abroad to incorporate. It's because the reality of raising funding, of gaining access to capital to do what they have to do on the continent is a challenge. And so they went elsewhere, and investors elsewhere have concerns about the legal environments in the markets where these companies are going to be based. They have questions about the operational capacity. They have questions about how money moves and also the corporate structure. And so as a result, this entrepreneurs have had to make compromises in order to get access to that risk capital that they need to get the ideas off the ground. And so once those ideas begin to scale and grow rapidly, that conversation comes back about, what are these companies? Are they local owners? Do they have enough local owners and stuff like that? And it begins to get tricky. But again, the root cause of that challenge is the fact that these companies, these founders need access to capital. The capital that they need is patient and risk capital. They can't find that on the continent in many cases, and so they go abroad. And so, it applies too for the kind of debt funding that many companies have tried to raise over the last 20 years, to even the governments too have actually look elsewhere or outward for the capital that they need in order to fund their budget, to carry out certain infrastructure investments. So it's not just unique to the companies themselves. Everybody's doing it. So I guess it's a case of countries have to do the work politically, on the one hand, to have the right legal framework for companies to, access capital and also encourage local ownership. At the same time, too, the capital formation locally has to be there in order to fund long-term sustainable growth for these businesses. And so it's a very tricky question to answer because once you begin to raise capital, once you need access to capital, particularly from an Africa point of view, you have to go abroad in many cases. And once you do that, you have to make compromises. So it's an unfortunate reality, but it is something that many companies have to face today, unfortunately.
And for both of you, how have you seen, African capital markets themselves developing? Are there any country kind of case studies where we've seen them adopt a more, say, open system, making it easier for investors to, if that is domestic investors, to have access to those markets and therefore increasing that domestic funding? Are there countries or examples where either of you have seen that kind of potential being unlocked?
I'm going to leave the specific examples to the business journalist, I think, but I will say on this issue of local ownership, I think the challenge of access to finance is a really important one and a huge constraint in a lot of African markets. But I was going to say that I take a little bit broader view on sort of this concept of ownership, right? And I think what is important, and I come from the policy world more so than the business world, but what's important, I think, from a policy lens is that African leaders, African societies sort of own the vision of their future development, right? And I think, and what does that look like in terms of jobs and the social contract? What kinds of public services should they expect from their government, and what kind of environment do they want to live and work in order to be able to fulfill their dreams, whether business or otherwise? And so, with that broader concept of ownership, I still think there's plenty of room for partnerships with international investors and so forth. And I think, as your own center's research has shown, the foreign direct investment is a very important repository of innovation and technical knowledge and, potential for value addition in African economies and things like this and competitiveness. And so I think it's really important for African countries, African leaders to want to attract that kind of investment because they're not able themselves. We talked earlier about the challenges of fiscal space. They're not able to invest as much as I think they should in research and development and these kinds of things. And so again, foreign investment is a resource for that, for upskilling your workforce, for again, creating more dynamic economies and so forth. So I don't think African countries should be worried or scared so much about foreign investment. I think finding those synergies where the international investors are helping to increase the capacity and the dynamism and the innovation taking place among local companies and firms and so forth. Those partnerships between international and local firms, I think, is a great way of sort of fostering the kinds of innovations that will be important for future growth and job creation in Africa. So, but specific examples.
Examples, let's see. I would say we've seen a few countries try to introduce, or should I say, support their capital markets in different ways. I mean, South Africa is a very good example, but South Africa is way more plugged into the global economy than any other part of sub-Saharan Africa. I would also say Kenya has also been historically a good market. The capital market is not as deep as South Africa's, nowhere close. But it is historically been a very attractive hub for international investors and international companies to be based in. And, at the same time, too, because of its proximity to the Middle East, where a lot of companies from Africa or serving Africa are based, particularly in Dubai, Kenya does become like a very important gateway to the African continent. But I would say specifically, Nigeria has been one of those markets where the capital market has been, should I say, more or less been attractive to international investors. There've been some policy direction, like, trying to get more companies to list locally, trying to encourage more companies in some cases to dual list abroad. And a few large companies have done so. and a few entrepreneurs have also, gone to the Nigerian capital markets to raise funding, especially in the case of Aliko Dangote, the continent's richest man who owns the Dangote cement factories, also owns the recently built the Dangote oil refinery in Nigeria to, at the very least, theoretically solve the Nigerian problem of, the oil problems on the in Nigeria. And so we've seen that he's done that, raised billions of dollars from international investors and local investors. But we've also seen specifically too the telecom companies in Nigeria and even in Africa list in Nigeria. So for example, the subsidiary of MTN Group in Nigeria called MTN Nigeria, which is the continent's largest single telecom market, telecom operator with over 100, maybe, if my memory serves me right, over 120 million subscribers, has listed locally in Nigeria way back in 2019, and it's one of the most valuable companies in Nigeria right now in the public market. We've also seen Airtel Africa list locally too, dual list in Nigeria and abroad, for the same reason too. So we've seen that encouraging movement in terms of encouraging companies to list locally. All of that has happened alongside, the ETFs focused on serving the African market, or should I say the sovereign wealth funds that have continued to invest in Nigerian public markets. When you check any of the big banks that are listed in Nigeria, they always have similar names. BlackRock, for example, as one of the largest investment firms in the world. Norges Bank has always been invested in the Nigerian capital market. And so all of those things signal positivity to international investors, in the sense that if this large wealth managers or fund managers are confident or comfortable investing in Nigeria and putting money in many of these, well-run companies in some cases, then maybe that's a good signal. And so it also signals good corporate governance at some of these firms. And so that encourages many companies or investors to want to put their money in foreign portfolio investments in Nigeria in this specific case. But yeah, it's been challenging overall because of capital control rules that countries have imposed over the last 15, 20 years, largely to control hot money that influences the foreign exchange rates in these countries. And so that in itself has always been a problem for investors who want to put money into the continent. They're always worried that if I want to liquidate, if I want to get my money out, how quickly can I do so? And do I have to take a haircut? Do I have to wait 6-7 months after I place the order in order to do so? At the same time, too, there's also that concern around, whether or not there's enough liquidity in the local markets to offer a good share price, to buy out your stake or whatnot. And so that has always been those are some of the concerns that investors have. And again, it all depends on how deep the local market is, liquidity-wise, and whether or not the governments can introduce more friendly capital control rules that would ensure that these investors feel more confident investing on the continent and pulling out their money when they need to.
Let me just add one thing. I mean, I think the big story for capital market development in Africa is that markets are very shallow, right? And I think I go back to something we had said earlier in the discussion about just how kind of fragmented the economies in Africa are. Lots of small markets, right? One of the things that USAID was provided some support to the Ethiopian exchange as they were trying to get set up. Is we brought SEC, U.S. Securities Exchange Commission advisors in to help them understand how to, start setting up their own exchange and so forth. But there's very few countries, I think, in Africa that on their own offer the possibility of sort of deep capital markets. Ethiopia is one, large population, theoretically large market. Nigeria is another. I think Kenya maybe brought, East Africa generally, South Africa. But I think conceptually, one of the things that still needs to happen is that a lot of these markets just need more integration to get to the depth of capital market development that would be necessary to support sort of robust growth in that space.
And to add to that point too, we've seen cases like in Ghana where they've tried to encourage to deepen the access to capital. They've encouraged use of mobile money to buy equities in publicly traded companies. They did that with MTN when it went public, I believe in 2018, MTN Ghana. And Nigeria has also done something similar. MTN Nigeria, when it went public, it encouraged people to buy equities and allocated a decent chunk of equities that was going to issue to the domestic market and to retail investors. And so we've seen very slow movement in that direction. But again, how many companies have gone public in the last 5-10 years on the continent? In Ghana, it took a long time before any company went public. And in Nigeria, can count maybe 10 over the same period. And so again, it's still that question of the depth of the market, access to capital, and the companies that are willing to go public because when they want to, or if the opportunity exists. So still all those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating interaction you just identified there with, the use of mobile money to increase, the deepness of the capital markets, to increase the availability to retail investors. And I want to turn a little bit to your reporting, on technology. And so, what are some trends that you've seen across Africa? Perhaps maybe we could talk a little bit about mobile money, but also other technological advancements that you've seen in innovation on the continent.
Yeah, that's a good question. Mobile money has always been the bellwether for the industry in terms of the ability to innovate. That has been the story that a lot of investors internationally have connected with, because you can see it in real time, being able to use your mobile phone to send and receive money, turn your mobile phone into your bank way before, digital banking, as it is right now, became a thing way back in 2007. And so you've seen that story. It's a great story. But beyond that, I think the industry in tech is diversifying in the level of innovation that's happening. And so for mobile money, it's a payment story, it's a banking story. But beyond that, there are other innovation that's coming up. Like, for example, we've had for a while, there was this focus on streaming. We've seen a few competitors come out in the space. Their success very uneven in the sense that some of them were successful for a while, then they went flatline. We've seen local ideas like Iroko TV come out way before, Spotify even came into the Nigerian market or in the African market. Iroko TV offered or offers access to streaming music, and also streaming like content like TV kind of content and movies, largely using content library that is local. And so we've seen that happen over the last 15 years. Now the company has been partially sold a bit of its content library to Canal Plus, but we have seen that aspect in media happening. We've also seen the growth of local ideas in soft sectors of the finance space, for example, in wealth management. That has been a big driver. It's not happened across the continent, but in a few markets like in Kenya and in Nigeria, for example, we've seen newer companies come out to increase the access to the capital markets for retail investors. A few popular names in the space, for example, are PiggyVest, which has over 1 million users and continue to disburse, hundreds of millions of dollars every year as returns to its, users. We've also seen a company like Harrywise come out offering a type of model that is similar to BlackRock in a sense, with aggregating mutual funds in the Nigerian market and offering that directly to retail investors. And so we've seen that model build up. We've also seen the broader space of payments. We've seen a few big names come out of that space, like Paystack, which is now owned by Stripe. We've seen Flutterwave come out, and all of this just basically tells you that there's a story around financial services innovation happening on the continent, largely on the one hand to improve the drive into financial inclusion, get more people financially included. On the other hand, too, we've also seen a few companies that are just looking out there for things that consumers actually want. And so that includes streaming, but it also includes e-commerce, where we've seen the likes of Jumia come out to serve the African market in terms of like access to real-time, or should I say, quick delivery for things that they need, ranging from large electronics to everyday items like groceries. And so we've seen this trend across a range of industries. And but I still think the biggest trend remains financial services, and which is why a lot of big companies have formed out of the space, and even the big telecom companies are looking to get into financial services, whether it's MTN, whether it's Orange in Francophone Africa. All of them want to pile in and develop a mobile money strategy over the next couple of years.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's really cool to see, incredible innovation that's happening across the continent. What do you think are a couple aspects of the technological advancement that we've seen in Africa that are really, kind kind of not necessarily understood by the outside world, things that, people really aren't looking into. I know you mentioned something that I've heard of before, which was, streaming and media, and then also with the wealth management platforms. Do you think those are kind of two areas that are generally not really touched upon enough, or are there maybe some other aspects?
Yeah, they are, in sense. So when you think about it, Nigeria has one of the largest content markets in the world. And I don't just say this from the number of eyeballs. I'm talking about for a number of productions, movie production, for example. So when you mentioned all the woods, so in the sense that there's Hollywood, there's Bollywood in India, and then obviously there's Nollywood, which is Nigerian version.
Obvious.
That has been a very popular, film industry over the last 20 years all across the African continent. When people think about African movie content and, content in general or entertainment content, they think in many cases Nollywood, and they consume it a lot. And so we've seen a few major companies come out in this space. For example, MultiChoice, which is now owned again by Canal Plus. It has focused on amplifying local content from the Nigerian market and from other African markets too, like in Ghana and South Africa. And so we've seen that entertainment space. It's very popular, and this is only for movies. When you look broader, you see the music industry has also been very successful. There's the genre, or should I say the category called Afrobeats, that has become a global phenomenon. And again, it's sprung out of Nigeria, it's sprung out of Ghana, it's become popular with the likes of Amapiano sound coming out of South Africa. And it's become a global, catch-all in terms of the kind of music that is coming out of the African continent. And so that in itself requires a bit more investment. We've not seen enough of it, particularly in live audience. For example, we've seen streaming media, Spotify, YouTube invest in this, but we've not seen enough in terms of like artist development and also like live music developments. There's still like a lot of things that still needs to be done in order to provide the right infrastructure for music content streaming to really take off on the continent. And so that in itself is something that a few companies on the continent are trying to actively get involved in. There's Kupanda Capital, working closely with Maven Records, which has been the home for many big artists from the African continent, including the Banj, Rema, and a few other acts that have come out of the continent that are super popular. And so there's been that. Other trend that I think is super important but is underreported is probably in data and cloud services. Again, the continent has 1.3 billion people. More than 400 million people currently are connected to the internet. Way more than that actually are connected to the internet, driving up huge amounts of data traffic to telecom companies, and then to the data services, and then obviously to the cloud services providers. That in itself is a story that has not been fully exploited or reported, in the sense that there is a need for data centers on the continent. Very few of the large hyperscalers like Google or AWS have deep presence on the continent. But we've seen a few companies come into the space like Equinix, where it acquired a company called Main One, which is one of the biggest, should I say, public cloud providers on the continent. A few years ago was acquired for around $230 million. But again, there still needs to be more and more investments in public cloud, in public infrastructure for broadband. And also, obviously, we've seen a few other companies try to build cables across the continent, or around the continent more accurately. In the case of Meta and Google, made investments just so that they can drive traffic and reduce the latency of moving bandwidth across the continent and reduce the cost in general. And so we've seen that trend happen, but we still need to pay attention to what are the companies investing in the public cloud, and how are they doing it, and how are they going to be able to amplify the growth of the digital ecosystem on the continent.
That's fascinating. I think, a broader question I wanted to turn to, so as we're going, you're kind of talking about technological investment and this incredible success story that you've seen. I wanted to broaden it for both of you. What do you think really, drives success in these nations? What are ways that policymakers and that entrepreneurs, that investors, can go about, creating that economic development and that economic growth that, we're all so hopeful for on the African continent?
Yeah, sure. I think the start of my answer would be kind of a reference back to our earlier discussion about ownership, in a way, is that, leadership that has this sort of positive vision for the future of their country and their communities and societies and so forth, I think is foundational, right? It's essential. In our business, you could always tell the difference between a country where the leadership had that vision and their message to us in the development assistance community was, here's our vision, here's where we need support. We don't need stuff that's outside of that. If you're offering things that are outside of that vision, don't bother. Help us achieve what we want to achieve. That compared to a country where there wasn't that vision, and development assistance partners like USAID, the British equivalent, the German equivalent, etc., we would all come with our ideas for how we could support, but without that kind of leadership guiding the priorities and the areas to focus on, we could step over each other. We could be investing in things that actually weren't priorities, et cetera. So you could always tell, the countries that had that leadership vision and drove toward it, those were the ones, I think, where our assistance had the most impact, frankly, because it was supporting something that they believed in, they wanted for themselves, for their countries, for their people, et cetera. And that kind of environment is what makes results sustainable in many ways, right? When there's, again, that local ownership, that commitment to what they're trying to achieve. So I think, to me, that, quite frankly, is the most important aspect. That doesn't mean, again, in our business, I worked for the U.S. government, and we had our own interests in many of these countries. And so what we were always looking for was kind of where that overlap existed between the priorities and interests of the country and U.S. priorities and interests, and how we could best align and support and so forth. And that involves some give and take, some genuine debate and discussion and so forth. That wasn't just, hey, from the country, please do this and line up right behind us. We had to say, well, here's our interest. Let's find ways that we can work together in achieving shared interests and so forth. And I think having that real, transparent debate, right, with partners in African countries, I found invigorating. To me, that's what local ownership looks like as well, is like this real, you're real partners, right? You might have a shared objective. You want to explore different ways of getting to that objective and so forth. You hash it out, you work together, and then you agree on a path forward. My most rewarding assignments in USAID were those where I had that kind of relationship with local government officials.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll build off of that and say one of the biggest challenges that people have, noted with investing in Africa is the policy somersault. It's like one government comes in, changes whatever policy existed a few years ago, and it happens every single time. So that consistency in terms of ownership of the vision is super critical for the long-term success of the African continent. And we've seen this in a few instances. For example, in Ethiopia, where the government has been focused on this liberalization drive in telecom and in banking, people bought into that idea because they see the consistency in terms of what the government wants to do. It's been slower than expected, but it's still something that people can pay attention to and say, this is something the government wants to do. Do we like the idea? Do we not? And they figure out what strategy they want to deploy. And a few companies have obviously gone ahead to buy into that vision. We've seen the same thing play out too in Nigeria, where we had a few policy ideas, or should I say policy statements. For example, there was the Vision 2020 in Nigeria that was launched, I believe, in 2010. We also had the broadband vision in 2015, or that was launched in 2010 for 2015. Both of those two initiatives helped to bring in the buy-in of the international community and also local entrepreneurs in terms of this is the direction the government or the country is heading towards. And this is the conversation we want to start having with people internationally for access to capital, resources, and other tools that they need for growth. I think unfortunately, many countries do not have this vision today compared to a few years ago. There hasn't been a lot of like serious work to develop real interests, ownership-led visions like this that are expansive and that dictate what the future for a country is going to look like. I think that if more countries do so, it's going to provide some sort of consistency and, should I say, a roadmap for the international community and also for the domestic ecosystem to think about what are the things that the government wants to prioritize over the next decade and begin to make active, work in that direction. And that ranges from things like infrastructure to food security to banking to, financial inclusion drive, which has been the most popular theme over the last 15 years with how governments have envisioned what growth to look like. And so I just think that that policy statement, that ownership, that vision is quite necessary now, particularly as the world is evolving and globalization itself is like something that governments need to reassess in terms of how exactly do we want to play in the world and where do we don't want to play. I think many countries still need to reassess those things to ensure that they are building the right things and providing the right resources for the rest of the international community.
For us, I think, that's excellent because you both, firstly highlighting the vision, needing to establish like what actions need to be taken to go forward to development, but then also the stability of that vision. That vision needs to stay consistent throughout time so that it's something that you can actually commit to. And I guess, my final question, I think we might have a lightning round at the end, would be, where do you see in the future, from your perspectives, kind of that vision in all these different countries kind of evolving? Where do you guys see, African development going in the future?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I think I'll refer back to something Abubakar said earlier in the discussion, which is that demographics in Africa are really important. By 2050, I think 1 in 4 people in the world will be African, and Africa by that point, 2050, will have 1/3 of the working age population in the world. Right, so that's a tremendous market opportunity. Right, if a lot of these countries can kind of get their economies right, that's a lot of potential job growth. It's again lots of a huge opportunity there. It also makes I think it enhances Africa's relevance to the world economy, right? I mean, it's Africa's opportunity really to kind of step up on the world stage. And, we're talking about energy transition and critical minerals and resources that they have. And again, the market opportunity that exists for Africa, and the dynamism of the African people and the entrepreneurial energy across the continent, I think is really motivating and inspiring youth. It is and will remain the youngest continent, so therefore more open to all kinds of new ways of doing things, innovation, and so forth. So I think to me that is really encouraging, and it's a great opportunity again for Africa and the world. The other thing too that I think Africa is well positioned to kind of lead the world on is the whole climate discussion, adaptation, and innovative models for dealing with some of those challenges. Again, they're more than any continent probably on the front lines of some of these challenges. And so they're going to have to innovate for sure. And I think we've seen some really interesting innovations in that space coming from Africa. I lived in Kenya for 4 years. And one of the things that I was always very taken with was their model for conservation. They call it this conservancy model. And it's a really fascinating partnership among government and private investors, in many cases foreign investors, local communities, Maasai communities. In some cases, they're allowed to preserve their livelihoods. And so it's just this very dynamic way of conserving natural resources while generating more investment in conservation, allowing local people to preserve things that are important culturally to their livelihoods and so forth. And so that kind of leads to my last point, which is I think and Abubakar mentioned this as well, is kind of the interest in patient capital, social impact investing, and right, like that a lot of today's investors my sense is, you guys tell me, you're the younger generation, but my sense is there's a growing interest in not just the near-term returns on investment, but what is that investment really doing in terms of social impact, environmental impact, and so forth. And I think that, to me, is really encouraging, is that investors increasingly bringing that longer-term perspective to what they're trying to do. Wow, it's amazing.
I completely agree with Brian there. And, to jump off, one of the key points that he mentioned is the entrepreneurial drive of, people on the continent. That has been, we call it different terms, but hustle culture is what most people know it as in places like Nigeria and West Africa broadly. It's just true. Like, people are looking to latch onto the right opportunities. And so that could be a good thing and a bad thing. Obviously, for many cases, it's been a bad thing in some cases, but in many other cases, it's also been the bedrock for the innovation and for the growth that we've seen on the continent. Nobody in Nigeria is waiting for the government to do anything for them. They want to do something by themselves. Same is true in Ghana, same is true in places in Francophone Africa. And so that drive is critical for the long-term growth of the continent. So I'm excited about that it exists largely is one key reason why I'm optimistic. The other thing that I'm optimistic about is a few countries are being more, deliberate or intentional with how they think about growth. And, Senegal has made some progress in that direction. Not entirely successful, but it has made some progress. It's that recognition. Nigeria is increasingly being intentional in that direction. After 8 years of slow growth, the country is finally on high growth, relatively higher GDP growth levels, and it's on, course reversal that is, helping the international community feel more optimistic. The World Bank recently released a report that actually shows that Nigeria has made several improvements across a range of things, particularly monetary policies, and that in itself is what the international investors are paying attention to. And so we're seeing that positive on the monetary side. We're hoping the fiscal side would catch up. And so for me, that is critical. In addition to that, I would say that the focus on climate change, there is more concern or more conversation about that right now, not simply from a resource extraction perspective, but from a infrastructure development perspective. And that is important because when you look at how Africa looks like today or how it operates today, it's still behind on literally everything energy-wise, use of energy, use of resources. There are fewer cars on the continent. There's not a lot of energy plants on the continent. We're still behind on many things. What that means is, in order for us to leap forward to the green revolution or the green technology, it's easier for us without having that legacy baggage to drag along. It also, it's quite optimistic for the rest of the continent. If we're able to do so, it would be exciting because we can generate sustainable economic growth without having to drag the rest of the world down in terms of carbon emission. And so that for me is something that if there's more direction in that part, would be exciting for me. Other thing that makes me excited, obviously, is the technology growth that we've seen, and the growth across a range of industries, not just in technology purely, but in banking, in education, and also in entertainment. And so I see that as a positive because it means that the continent is creating superstar companies too, and leading innovation, like we've seen in the case of mobile money, that the rest of the world will want to emulate. We've also seen that obviously in payments. In places like Nigeria, it had real-time payments as a national infrastructure way before even the US introduced one, and even before Kenya did one, and even before India introduced one in 2016. Nigeria had one since 2012. And so for me, these are some of the positives that one can pay attention to. And then lastly would be migration can be tricky, but I will say that the diaspora is becoming way more integrated into the continent's activities. And so for me, that creates an opportunity for cross-continental, synergies that would help to fuel the growth of the continent, whether it's in investing or in cultural exports. I think that for me is something to pay attention to and be excited about.
Wonderful. It sounds like we have good reason to be hopeful about the future of the African continent. Lourdes, would you like to hit them with the lightning round? Do you have anything to add?
Yes. So government-led or private-led development, probably both. So that's a discussion that for sure we will continue in next webinars. Second, they need to look inside and outside. And outside, we have the US, of course, the traditional partner, Europe as well. But again, China being a newcomer. And third, in many ways, the need for integration amongst many ethnicities, many religions, many languages. You need more than ever integration. And we have COP because, as you mentioned, Brian, the African continent free trade agreement that is now working, and also the need for integration because we need access to capital, and then stock markets are too small. Separately, they need to be more integrated, more coordinated. And then last but not least, innovation, technology, creative industries, mobile payments that, of course, give hope to the young people that are in Africa and everywhere. So thank you very much, Brian, Abubakar, and thank you, Thomas, for leading the discussion. Looking forward to the next one on behalf of the Canizares Center for Emerging Markets and also AMIC. Thank you for attending. Thank you.
Thank you, Purples.
Nothing contained herein constitutes tax, legal, insurance, or investment advice, or the recommendation of, or an offer to sell, or the solicitation of an offer to buy or invest in any investment product, vehicle, service, or instrument. The views expressed by participants are entirely their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Canizares Center or the institutions which they represent.